Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into the source material you sent over. And it really zooms in on U.S. foreign policy, specifically counterterrorism and the relationship with Pakistan.
Yeah, and what you notice straight away is, well, these sources are pretty critical. They make some strong claims, things like contradictions. Even the word duplicity comes up regarding America's strategy. So what we want to do in this deep dive is unpack those main arguments, look at the evidence the sources actually present. We're aiming to understand the perspectives laid out in your material, strictly sticking to that, and see what insights pop up about this, well, let's face it, very complex area. And the sources, right from the get-go, point to some things they find. Let's say eyebrow raising, like a big invitation that causes some worry, or you have a U.S. official calling a country a valuable partner while the source is basically questioning their whole record. Okay, let's get into it. So the main thread, the sort of core argument running through your material, is this idea that the U.S. shows double standards, duplicity even in how it fights terrorism.
And the focus really narrows onto the U.S. relationship with Pakistan, which, according to these sources, uses terrorism as, well, state policy. And the event they really used to anchor this point is an invitation. It was for Pakistan's Army Chief, General Asim Munir. He was apparently invited, the sources say, to the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Army back on June 14th in Washington. This was under President Trump's leadership. And the sources present this as, quite significant. Their take is that it hints at maybe the start of better relations between Washington and the Pakistani Army.
Right, and the material connects that potential improvement to why it's seen as a worry, particularly, the sources emphasize, from an Indian viewpoint. It mentions this backdrop of what the source calls a recent warlike situation and just generally strained India-Pakistan ties. It's quite something how one diplomatic invite can be read so differently depending on where you stand regionally, as the source points out.
Okay, so let's break down the specific points the sources are using to back this up, this claim of duplicity. They mention quite a bit of criticism coming from India's strategic community that's laid out in the material you sent. Apparently, these analysts have serious concerns. They see potential problems for India coming out of this. And a really concrete example the source brings up related to India-Pakistan is the Pulwama attack. The material gives specifics. It says Pakistani terrorists killed 25 Indian citizens, one foreigner, too, in Baisaran Valley. And it stresses, importantly, that the targeting was religion-based.
And the sources tie this right back to the bigger picture they're painting about the U.S., maybe, looking the other way on Pakistan's history. The Indian defense analysts, they quote, well, they warn that moves like this invitation seem to ignore Pakistan's alleged long history. Supporting figures like Osama bin Laden or Hafiz Saeed, the 2611 mastermind, that's what the analysts in the source claim. So this feeds directly into the source's argument about what it terms selective memory in foreign policy.
Right, selective memory.
Yeah.
The sources also describe U.S. policy here as, well, lacking clarity, being driven by, quote, transactional diplomacy, or that same selective memory.
Transactional diplomacy, yeah.
Yeah, the view presented is that historically the U.S. has given arms, funding to Pakistan's military. Publicly, it's framed as being for regional stability, but the sources argue it happened despite what they call Pakistan's poor track record on terror, which suggests, the transactional part support for something in return, maybe not looking too closely at the underlying issues alleged by the source.
And there's a big geopolitical piece to this as well, highlighted in the sources. They claim the U.S. has been trying to draw India closer, partly to counter China, but at the same time, it's supporting Pakistan, which the sources flat out call China's closest regional proxy.
So that invitation to Munir.
Exactly. In that view presented by the source, the invitation looks like an attempt to maybe pull Pakistan away from China's orbit a bit, or at least counter its influence there, which for the source just reveals these clashing priorities within U.S. strategy. It doesn't quite add up for them.
Okay, let's pivot to another specific piece of evidence the sources bring forward. This is a statement from General Michael Kurilla. He's the chief of U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM. And according to your sources, he was speaking to the U.S. Senate Committee, and he actually called Pakistan a valuable partner in counterterrorism.
A valuable partner?
Yeah. And the material gives the reason cited in the source for this praise. It was apparently Pakistan's arrest and extradition of an ISIS-K planner, Mohammed Sharifullah. The source identifies him as responsible for that awful 2021 Abbey Gate attack, killed 13 U.S. soldiers, 160 civilians. And the sources add that General Munir himself told Kurilla about the arrest.
Okay, but right after laying that out, the sources jump straight to the counter-argument, their criticism. They immediately bring up General Munir's alleged connection to the Pulwama attack. Using that contrast, you see, to really hammer home what they perceive as America's, well, very selective approach here, the sources frame it as this tension, acknowledging one specific act of cooperation, like the arrest,
Right.
while seemingly setting aside these other broader, very serious historical allegations that the sources keep raising.
The material gets quite specific here, including direct quotes or at least paraphrased points from Indian analysts. It mentions Lieutenant Colonel Manoj Channon, he's retired. And his points, as reported in the source, are pretty sharp, criticizing Kurilla's statement, saying it ignores India's core security worries. He apparently states that praising Pakistan, given its alleged history of sheltering terrorists, well, that doesn't show sound judgment.
Strong words.
Very. And he's quoted urging Washington to basically stop putting terrorism sponsors on the same level as victims, especially if the U.S. sees India as a true strategic partner. Channon emphasized, according to the source, look, India's not objecting to U.S.-Pakistan relations in themselves, but clarity on terrorism. That's non-negotiable. Calling for more transparency, more consistency from the U.S. That's the gist from the source.
And this isn't just about bilateral relations, according to the sources. They broaden the scope. They argue these alleged double standards. They even play out at the United Nations.
How so?
Well, the material points to Pakistan getting some key roles in UN Security Council committees back in June. Specifically, chairing the 1988 Taliban Sanctions Committee and being vice chair of the 1373 Counterterrorism Committee.
Oh.
And the sources make a big deal about the timing. They say this happened just a month after something called Operation Sindoor. The sources find this, frankly, shocking, particularly given their claim that Osama bin Laden was supposedly living under Pakistani military protection after 26/11.
That's a major claim from the...
Huge claim.
Yeah.
And they argue the U.S. and its allies, they just stayed silent, allowing, and this is the source's phrasing, a terrorism-sponsoring nation to take the lead on anti-terrorism efforts at the UN, which, for the source, just lays bare what they see as blatant hypocrisy on the world stage.
The sources also try to give this some historical weight. They bring up experts who recalled Henry Kissinger's old warning, that being too close to America isn't always a good thing for other countries.
The Kissinger angle.
Yeah. And they link this to the U.S. experience in Afghanistan, that 20-year counterterrorism campaign. The sources mention the huge cost, $5 trillion, countless lives. And they argue the campaign failed, at least in part, because of Pakistan's alleged support for the Taliban throughout.
A crucial point in their narrative.
Definitely. And the argument then follows. Despite all that history, despite Pakistan allegedly undermining U.S. goals, America still treats Pakistan like an ally, ignoring, as the sources put it, Pakistan's self-serving motives and exploitation of U.S. aid.
And this all builds towards the end of the material, where the sources issue what they call a call to action, and it's aimed squarely at India.
Okay, what's the call?
They argue that U.S. actions, even under President Trump, who some saw as tough on terror, actually reveal a pattern. The sources perceive the U.S. and other Western nations, too, as, quote, nurturers of terrorism when it serves their own interests.
Wow. Nurturers of terrorism. That's strong language from the source.
Extremely strong. Their conclusion is blunt. America, they claim, only really goes after terrorists who pose a direct threat to American interests. So for India, which the source's position as having led a global anti-terror campaign, the takeaway, according to them, is the need for a renewed fight against what they call Islamic terrorism and, crucially, a self-reliant fight. The sources state pretty clearly, don't expect U.S. help here. India needs to rely on its own strength to face this challenge.
Right. So reflecting on all this from your source material, where does that leave us? We've walked through the core argument about alleged U.S. duplicity in counterterrorism. We looked at the specific examples the sources used, General Munir's invitation, General Kurilla's comments. We've seen how the sources portray the complex U.S.-Pakistan relationship through their critical lens, covered the reactions from India detailed in the material, the points made about the UN, that historical perspective they bring in. Throughout this deep dive, our aim was just to unpack the key arguments, the specific claims, and the viewpoints presented only in the sources you shared.
And maybe just to leave you with a final thought stemming from these sources, considering the arguments presented here about, conflicting interests, these accusations of selective approaches, the sheer difficulty of pinning down who's an ally in the fight against terror, how does any nation juggle its own diverse strategic aims with this messy reality of global partnerships? Can you actually achieve true consistency in foreign policy, or is that even desirable when you're facing such varied, complex, and sometimes contradictory challenges? Something to ponder as you continue looking into this.